So, Prince Louis is 7 years old and carrying the emotional weight of a year that nearly broke the House of Windsor. And the palace has finally stopped pretending everything was fine. That's the story here. Not a formal diagnosis, not a press release with medical jargon, but a quiet confirmation through William's own words that the youngest Wales child struggled in ways nobody saw coming. And when you actually look at what was said versus what happened, the timeline reveals something much heavier than a kid having a bad few months. This was a child processing grief in real time while the world expected him to wave from a balcony. Before we get into it, if you're into royal deep dives that actually connect the dots instead of just reading headlines, hit subscribe to Crownatch. It takes 2 seconds and honestly, it helps more than you think. All right, back to Louis. The thing that gets me is how quiet this all was. There were no sirens, no dramatic ambulance photos, no sources fear the worst tabloid frenzy. It crept in the way real family crises do, which is to say through the small stuff. A 6-year-old noticing his mom isn't at breakfast. A grandfather who's suddenly too unwell to do the things he used to do. A house that feels different even when everyone's trying to act normal. That's where Louise was in March 2024 when Catherine announced her cancer diagnosis after weeks of figuring out how to tell George, Charlotte, and Louis in a way they could understand. And look, the palace did what palaces do. They managed the message, controlled the narrative, kept the kids out of sight, but you can't control how a child feels. You can't spin a 7-year-old's anxiety into a neat PR line. Sources close to Adelaide Cottage, which is where the Wales family actually lives, that 4-bedroom house they chose specifically to keep things grounded, started describing something that should make any parent's stomach drop. Louis, the kid who became famous for covering his ears and trooping the color, making funny faces, jumping on carriage seats, just being utterly unbothered on a global stage. That kid went quiet. The boy who expressed everything openly, who never learned to hide his feelings because he never needed to, suddenly had feelings too big for his small body. And he didn't have the words for them. He was 6 years old when his mom told him she had cancer. 6. You try explaining chemotherapy to a 6-year-old. You try explaining why grandpa's hair is different, why mommy's tired all the time, why the house feels like everyone's holding their breath. Catherine and William did try, and by all accounts they did it thoughtfully and carefully. But intention doesn't erase impact. The impact was there. It was real. And it landed hardest on the youngest. Here's where the timeline gets interesting. King Charles revealed his own cancer diagnosis just weeks before Catherine went public with hers. So within the span of a month, Louis found out his mother and his grandfather, 2 of the most important figures in his life, were both facing serious illness. That's not a normal childhood stressor. That's not a scraped knee or a bad dream. That's existential fear delivered in kid-sized doses and him not knowing what to do with it. Sources said he started asking questions that had no clear answers. He sought comfort at night. His wide eyes, that phrase, stuck with me, reflected an unspoken weight. That's not a child being difficult. That's a child being scared. And the palace stayed silent, not because nothing was happening, but because too much was. William later called 2024 the hardest year of his life. That's not a throwaway line from a man who performs composure for a living. That's a future king admitting he was drowning. And the moment he let that crack show, everything shifted. But before we get to that moment, we have to sit with what those early weeks actually looked like inside Adelaide Cottage. Because the palace silence wasn't emptiness, it was pressure. The kind of pressure that builds when everyone knows something is wrong, but no one is allowed to say it out loud. Staff members were instructed to maintain absolute discretion. The children's school was given only the information necessary to ensure their safety and privacy. Friends of the family described a household operating on 2 tracks simultaneously. The public track where everything appeared managed and controlled, and the private track where 6-year-old was waking up at odd hours asking if his mother was going to die. You can't schedule that. You can't put that in a briefing document. It just happens and you deal with it in the dark at 2 a.m. with a child who doesn't understand why the world suddenly feels so fragile. Williams spoke later about the difficulty of those early days. Not in graphic detail, but enough to convey the exhaustion. He mentioned the constant mental load, the effort of keeping things normal when nothing was normal. For a man who had spent his entire adult life learning to compartmentalize, to separate the public role from the private self, this was different. This was his wife, his children, his father all at once. And the compartment walls didn't hold. They couldn't because when your 6-year-old asks a question you don't know how to answer, there's no royal protocol for that. There's just you and him and the silence that follows. October 2025, William sits down with Eugene Levy for that Apple TV Plus series, The Reluctant Traveler, filmed at Windsor Castle. It's supposed to be light, charming, maybe a little awkward in the way William sometimes is. But Levi asks about the kids, about how George, Charlotte, and Louis were affected by Catherine's illness. And William pauses. Not the kind of pause where he's choosing the right diplomatic phrase. The kind where a father is deciding how much truth he can afford to let out. What he said next, I want to get it right because it matters. Everyone has their own coping mechanisms for these sorts of things. Children are constantly learning and adapting. We try to make sure we give them the security and safety they need. We're a very open family, so we talk about things that bother and trouble us, but you never quite know the knock-on effects it can have. That phrase, knock-on effects, that's the one that landed like a stone in still water. Because that's not the language of a man in control. That's a father admitting he doesn't know what's happening inside his own child's head, and is scared of what he might find there. Royal correspondents immediately flagged it as one of the most honest admissions from a senior royal in years. And that's saying something because the bar for royal honesty is buried underground. William went further, saying sometimes he felt like he was oversharing with the children, but hiding things from them doesn't work. Think about that. A man raised in a family where the motto was essentially never complain, never explain. Saying that hiding things from his kids doesn't work. That's a philosophical break from generations of royal parenting. But it's also an acknowledgement that he tried maybe to protect them by controlling information and it didn't matter. Louise still knew something was wrong. Louis still felt it cause kids always feel it. Then February 2026, BBC Radio 1 Mental Health Special. William's talking about his children's emotional lives and he laughs about how they sometimes share too much. But then the laugh catches and he says something that should be printed in every parenting book ever written. You feel a sense that you need to fix it for everyone and that I find quite difficult. A future king admitting he cannot fix everything. For millions of parents watching that hit different because that's the job, right? You're supposed to fix it. You're supposed to make it better. And when you can't, when the thing hurting your child is something you can't remove, something you might have inadvertently caused just by being sick, the guilt is enormous. William was describing in measured, careful language a child in quiet pain. And sources close to the family later confirmed what many already suspected. The child he couldn't stop thinking about was Louis. Let's talk about what was actually happening inside that house. No statement, no photographs, no curated updates, but insiders painted a picture that was hard to look away from. William took weeks off from royal duties in March 2024. To be present, he kept routines, school runs, bedtime rituals, weekend activities. He was described as constantly sanguine, which is a polite way of saying he was holding it together by force of will. But the kids were watching, and Louis, the most physically expressive, the one who wore every emotion on his face. He was the one who couldn't hide it. Russell Mayers, in his book about William and Catherine, cited an aide who said both parents explained the situation calmly, detailing how long Catherine would be away and what to expect. Calm and composed in the moment. But composure in the moment doesn't mean calm processing afterward. In the months that followed, Louis developed what child psychologists call secondary anxiety. That's not a diagnosis of him. It's a clinical term for what happens when a child witnesses a parent's illness and internalizes the fear. It manifests differently in every kid. In Louis, it showed up as quietness, uncharacteristic quietness. The boy who once made the world laugh by being loudly, joyfully himself went silent. Breakfast grew quieter. Questions came late at night. Small rituals that used to feel ordinary now carried weight. A mother not at the table, a grandfather not well. There was an energy in the house that even the most cheerful child could sense. And Louise sensed it. Here's something else people forget. Louise wasn't just processing his mother's illness. He was processing the absence of her presence in the tiny mundane moments that make up a child's day. The way she used to ruffle his hair before school. The particular way she'd say his name when he was being silly. The sound of her moving through the house. Always there, always constant. When that disappears, even temporarily, a child notices, not consciously maybe, but somewhere deep in the nervous system, the absence registers as threat. And for a kid like Louis, who had never known anything but stability, that threat was enormous. He didn't have the vocabulary to say, "I feel unmed," or "I'm scared of losing my mother." So, he said it the only way he could. He got quiet. He stopped eating as much. He lingered near doorways. He asked for lights to stay on at night. These are the details that don't make headlines, but matter more than any official statement. Catherine addressed this later after finishing chemotherapy in a social media video. She said, "The cancer journey is complex, scary, and unpredictable for everyone, especially those closest to you, especially those closest." Including a 7-year-old who lacked the words to express his feelings. That's not a throwaway line either. That's a mother acknowledging that her youngest child suffered in a way she couldn't immediately fix. And that's the part that gets me honestly. The palace can manage a media cycle. They can't manage a child's grief. School staff at Lambrook, where all 3 Wales kids attend, were apparently aware of the family's circumstances. Pastoral care was quietly enhanced. Mental Health Awareness Week and Anti-Bullying Week are on the school calendar anyway, but this was different. A child going through what Louis was experiencing needed more than curriculum. He needed to be seen, and behind palace walls, away from cameras and coordinated appearances, his parents were trying to see him. But they were also falling apart themselves quietly, and that's a hard thing to hold. Enter Princess Charlotte, 9 years old at the time and already carrying a reputation as the peacekeeper. The one who smoothed things over before conflicts escalated. During the darkest months, Charlotte directed that steadiness toward Louis. She checked on him, sat with him, inserted herself into his routines in a way only an older sibling can. She brought normally that adults, no matter how loving, couldn't entirely provide. And that's beautiful. But it's also heartbreaking because Charlotte was carrying her own confusion and grief while trying to shield her little brother from his. That's a lot for a 10-year-old. That's a lot for anyone. There's a detail that came out later through sources close to the family that I still think about. Charlotte apparently started leaving small notes under Louis' pillow. Nothing profound, just little drawings and scribbled messages like, "See you at breakfast and you're my favorite brother." She never mentioned it to anyone. It wasn't performative. It was just what she did when she noticed he was struggling to fall asleep. That kind of quiet, instinctive care doesn't come from being told to help. It comes from love. And it probably did more for Louise than any formal counseling session could have because it told him in the language of childhood that he wasn't alone. That someone else in that house understood things, felt different, and was still there, still present, still solid. William later praised his children's resilience, saying they managed brilliantly. And sure, they did. But managing brilliantly doesn't mean emerging unscathed. Inside Adelaide Cottage, a portrait emerged of 3 kids supporting each other while the ground shifted beneath them. Louis, the youngest, trembling with emotion. Charlotte, the anchor, and George, presumably doing what he could in his own way. Catherine, even while recovering, kept returning to the children. Her mother, Carol Middleton, was described as a tower of strength working to maintain normally. They called the kids kitties, which is adorable and also devastating when you think about the smallest kitty quietly processing something the cameras never caught. But Charlotte saw it and she stayed. There's a particular kind of love in that. The love of a child who can't fix anything but refuses to let her brother face it alone. Child development experts will tell you that sibling connection during parental illness is one of the strongest protective factors for long-term resilience. Charlotte didn't know that. She just did it. And slowly, haltingly, Louise began to breathe easier. Then came the unconventional step that started bringing him back. It wasn't a therapy room or a palace directive. It was movement, routine, safety. The Wales family had chosen Adelaide Cottage specifically for a smaller, more normal lifestyle. 4 bedrooms, not a palace, grounded, real. That choice proved beneficial. Louis was given space to move, breathe, and exist without being watched. He could be himself, free from performing, and slowly he re-emerged. William noticed the first morning Louis bounded down the stairs with his old energy. The first meal where every plate was emptied, the first genuine laugh without tension underneath. These were small moments, but they signaled something huge. His son would be okay. Recovery isn't linear, though. That's something the palace never explicitly stated, but the timeline implies. There were good days and bad days. Days when Louis seemed almost like his old self, and days when he retreated again. The difference over time was that the good days started outnumbering the bad ones. The questions at night became less frequent, then stopped altogether. The breakfast table grew louder again. The lights could be turned off without protest. These are the markers of healing that no doctor measures but every parent recognizes. And William, for all his public composure, was watching for them, counting them, holding on to them like evidence that they were going to make it through. By June 2025, at Trooping the Color, the world saw it. Louis, 7 years old, black suit, red tie, burying his face in his hands at just the right moment, waving so enthusiastically that George had to remind him to stop. Mischievous, uncontainable, magnificently himself, the boy had returned. But what the cameras captured was only the surface of a much longer, quieter journey. And the final piece of that journey wasn't a medical intervention. It was a palace statement that changed everything. Here's what Buckingham and Kensington Palace actually confirmed quietly and with the parents' full knowledge. A royal child had been struggling not with a diagnosed illness but with the emotional fallout of a family health crisis. And the family chose to talk about it. In October 2025, William acknowledged how Catherine's illness affected the kids. In February 2026, he admitted he felt the need to fix everything and found it difficult for an institution built on silence. These were seismic words. Commentators noted that William was changing how royalty deals with personal challenges, choosing honesty over image management, and that honesty reached Louis in ways that mattered. Because when a child sees a parent express feelings openly, they learn permission. Permission to feel, to talk, to be loved, even while struggling. Catherine's openness did the same. She called the journey complex, scary, unpredictable. She expressed gratitude for kindness. By being open, she gave Louise something no royal tradition could provide, the truth that tough times happen to anyone, even royal families. William later said, "Overcoming challenges defines who they are." He expressed pride in his wife and children. And at Trooping the Color, the evidence showed Louis waved, mimicked King Charles, laughed. He was 7 years old and full of life. There's a longer lesson here, too, about what it means to parent through crisis when the world is watching. The Wales family could have hidden everything. They could have kept Louis out of sight until he seemed fine again, then trotted him out with a rehearsed smile. Plenty of royal families have done exactly that. But they didn't. They let the cracks show. They let William stumble over his words on television. They let Catherine acknowledge that the journey was scary. They let Louis be seen in all his messy, joyful, struggling humanity. That's not weakness. That's a different kind of strength. And it's probably the thing that saved them. So, what the palace confirmed wasn't just a statement. It was a story of a family that faced something terrifying together and emerged changed, but united. In a world where royalty often feels distant, this was a reminder of their humanity. That's the true story of Prince Louis and the health crisis that impacted the Wales family. Not the gossip version, but the one told through William's words, Catherine's strength, and the small moments at home that no camera could capture. The monarchy is still keeping plenty quiet. Of course, that's what they do. But this time, the silence broke enough to let us see something real. And honestly, that's more than we usually get. Let the palace confirm what it wants. The truth was already there. In a 7-year-old's wide eyes and a father's admission that he couldn't fix everything, Louis carried the weight of a year that nearly broke his family. And he carried it alone until the people who loved him